Deborah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, Deborah, we're here to talk about your book, Credible: Why Without Abusers and Protect Abusers. But before that, I would like to ask you a little bit about your background. You are a professor of law at Northwestern University. You were an assistant district attorney in New York. So you have a lot of experiences to share. I mean, that could take the whole podcast. I just want a little bit of a window to see who you are and why are you bringing this book to us.
Sure. I started my career as a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and I handled cases that involved domestic violence and child abuse and sexual violence, and really started thinking about credibility early on in my career, because every one of these cases involved an account by someone who described horrific abuse, and the word of that person was central to the case. So this was on my mind from the very early days of my career. I became a law professor back in 2002 and have continued to think about these issues and to write about these issues in various ways. And so this book is sort of the culmination of decades of thinking about this topic on the ways that credibility is critical to resolving these kinds of cases.
Okay, you cut out for a little bit, so I didn't get to hear part of what you were telling us. But okay, let me ask you this. First of all, why, as a young woman, were you inclined to study law?
Well, I think that law and culture and the relationship between them have always fascinated me. I think that the law is fundamental in shaping the ways that we think about ourselves, the ways that we relate to one another. And certainly if we care about power imbalances in our society and injustices, the law is, I think, one of the first places that we would look to make improvements and to right some of these wrongs.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, that's when I meet law students, I see two camps: the camp of law students who want to go out and save the world from the injustice, and the ones who want to make a lot of money. And many of them also save the world from injustice. You decided to become a district attorney, so I guess the way for you to protect people from the injustice is just to take the district attorney's seat. And you specialize in domestic violence. I had an interview with a judge, and she was telling me about the horrendous amount of cases that she had to see on a regular basis. So I assume you, as a prosecutor in domestic violence, you had to see also this dark side of society. I wonder why you will go into this realm of the law, which I find as very difficult and testing to your endurance, your emotional and human endurance.
Well, it's certainly a difficult job. It's not for everyone, but I found that working with survivors day in and day out was inspiring. And the fact that I could do something, however small, to help with healing and to help move forward toward justice was a really good focusing mechanism. It kept me kind of looking to what I was able to do to help the situation, however horrific. And I should add that the resilience that I witnessed on the part of survivors who had been through such often terrible ordeals was also a way to kind of keep focused on what I could do to help, as opposed to getting just overwhelmed by the misery of it all.
Okay, last questions in regards to this part of your life. I wonder what was the emotional toll on you after, let's say, you finish your job? You never finish at 5 o'clock like most people do, but you finish your day at a given time, and then you have to go home after reading all these horrendous things that happen in everyday life. It's not like an isolated cases. It's a deluge of horrendous cases day after day. So what was the emotional toll for you going back home with your family?
Well, you're right. It's not a job that you can leave behind at the office. It's something that you carry with you. And, still to this day, decades later, I sort of bring with me those stories, those relationships, those experiences that I had as a prosecutor. But I wasn't the one who suffered the violence. And so that, always put in perspective, I think what I was witnessing. And I felt incredibly grateful to have had that job. And I continue to think that it's a job where you can have an impact on the lives of people in a way that few other jobs allow.
Okay, great. Now let's go into the topic of the book. First of all, why you felt the need to write this book?
Well, as I mentioned, have been thinking about credibility for a very long time, and the way in which credibility affects all of the ways in which these cases are resolved. The law can only do so much. The law is applied by people. And if people are not making fair credibility judgments, then it doesn't really matter what the laws on the books are. I also felt as if credibility judgments happen every day, not just in the legal system, but in our interactions with our friends and our family members, our roommates, our coworkers, and that this was an aspect of credibility that was sort of not being discussed enough. And then the Me Too movement happened, and suddenly these stories were everywhere, and we were talking about sexual abuse in very new ways. And yet still, this underlying lurking problem of credibility, I think, wasn't being surfaced. And so the book is an effort, I think, to move the conversation forward in productive ways. It's really a call to do better in the ways that all of us judge credibility, to be more fair, to be more accurate, because without that kind of evolution across our society, I don't think that this movement is going to have the kind of staying power that many of us would hope it will.
When I think of credibility, and you bring this in your book, there are so many dynamics. There's power, there's racial dynamics, there is economics, power. And if I had to draw a layer of credibility, I would put at the top of the pyramid white straight men, and at the bottom of the pyramid, Black marginalized woman. If you had to put, I don't know, fill the other layers, how would you arrange them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say first, and you alluded to this, that I want people to think about credibility as a form of power that is meted out along familiar axes of power. So wherever you see a power imbalance, wherever you see someone who is in a position of more status, more privilege, that is an individual who is likely to be deemed credible. And on the flip side, somebody who is more marginalized, more vulnerable, more oppressed, that is a person who is less likely, or even least likely, to be determined to be a credible individual, or to be giving a credible account. And so what I encourage, readers and listeners to do is to think in an intersectional way about this. I talk a lot in the book about gender, and I do think that as a rule, women who come forward, particularly with accusations of abuse, are less likely to be deemed credible than men. But it's not just gender that's involved here. And as you said, we need to be thinking about race. We need to be thinking about socioeconomic status, immigration status, disability, LGBTQ status, and on down the line. Certain professions are less powerful in our culture. And so any place where you see this kind of gap in power, that's where you should start to notice credibility judgments being meted out in unfair, unjust ways.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to imagine this this pyramid that I just mentioned a minute ago, and let's say in May 2020 there was this lady called Amy Cooper who pulled out her phone and say, "I'm going to tell the police that it's a African American man threatening my life." So, in that situation, her power dynamic was superior to this other guy based on race and based on the perception of who's more credible. In her mind, she would be more credible being that she's a white woman and the other person is a black man. So it doesn't, I mean, it's generally men who are more credible, but not all the time. I mean, this guy, and I wonder how much damage this lady, Amy Cooper, did to the credibility of many women.
Yeah, well, that's a really important point. And as I said earlier, the general rule is that women have less credibility than men when they come forward. But a major exception to that is the one that you point to, white women who have made over time allegations of abuse against Black men. And that's a place where, because power dynamics are inverted, you've seen unjust responses in the opposite direction from the one that I talk a lot in the book about. And you've seen Black men who were wrongly accused, and you've had the white women over time whose word has been given too much authority, too much credibility. And that legacy endures today. I talk a lot about the history of enslaved people in particularly the United States, and the ways in which the sexual assault of Black women was not considered to be a crime, was not to be considered real. And the ways in which white women who alleged sexual assault by Black men, again, were considered to be trustworthy, even when they shouldn't have been. Well, that is a story from the past, but of course we can't escape our past entirely. And so still today, you see these power dynamics in place, and they kind of flip the general rule that I talk about.
Right. I wonder what's the place of enablers in this power dynamic. I mean, we have the case not too long ago of Ghislaine Maxwell, who was found guilty of recruiting young girls for Jeffrey Epstein, and so this big guy, this guy with all the economic power in the world, and has a woman helping him recruit lure girls or young girls for his sexual fantasies. But there's a responsibility there. There's not only Epson who is guilty, but also Ghislaine, who is an enabler of this crime.
Yes, I have a piece in the New York Times from last week where I talk about the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell as setting a marker that enablers are not safe from criminal prosecution, that in the most extreme, egregious cases where the assistance is active and it's knowing and it's deliberate, the criminal justice system does have a role to play. And at the same time, I caution that there are more enablers whose behavior is outside the proper reach of criminal law. This is not a problem that we're going to solve by criminal prosecution alone. There's a cultural, collective responsibility for protecting particularly powerful abusers in our midst. And you can see that when you look at the open secrets that were Harvey Weinstein's abuse, Bill Cosby's abuse, R. Kelly's abuse, and on down the line. Those are cases where I think we ought to think very carefully about the ways in which even ordinary people, even people who weren't central to the abuse, as Ghislaine Maxwell was to Jeffrey Epstein's abuse, even ordinary people play a role in providing impunity for abusers.
Wow. And of course, it's the most common of the power dynamics is money, and I find that many corporations, either they have non-disclosure agreement or a way to dispute allegations, but even when everything fails, there's big corporations like Google, Uber, WeWork that just have a line item to pay off people who claim sexual misconduct, and this goes on in the millions and millions of dollars. So it's still not only the person, but also the corporation seems to have all the power and the money to get away with crime.
Yeah, these are systems, these are interlocking systems that protect powerful abusers. And it's not that there aren't culpable individuals. Certainly there are, but to my mind, it's essential that we scrutinize these systems themselves, because without doing so, we will never dismantle them. And without dismantling them, we will continue the status quo.
Right. And one of the great movements of this generation was the metoo movement, and you mentioned that in your book. But this metoo movement was started in 2006 by Tara Burke, a Black woman, and it was almost unnoticed for 10 years until Alyssa Milano brought it in 2017, a white woman. So it still shows the race dynamics, like, oh, we Black women, we have been suffering from this injustice for decades, but here we go, a white woman claims she's being sexually abused, and now it's all over social media.
Yes, I think that it's overly simplistic to talk about gender and to talk about women without taking into account these overlapping power imbalances in our society, race being at the very top of the pyramid that you described earlier.
Okay, so what are some possible solutions that could be implemented in the system so that the abuse could be better protected? Because the abuse is put to this cycle of testing whether she's, and I say she, but whether the accuser is credible or not. What would be some ways to improve the system?
Yes, and before answering the question, I want to make very clear that men and boys can be victims of abuse too. And there's statistics suggest that the overwhelming majority of abuse victims are women, but I don't want to overlook the fact that non-binary people and men and boys can also be victims and accusers here. So the book talks about the law and places where the law can be reformed, because it does this thing called credibility discounting, which is, as you know, sort of a main theme of the book, is that we discount the credibility of marginalized accusers and we inflate the credibility of powerful, particularly men who are accused of abuse. And so wherever the law embeds the credibility discount, we can certainly reform it. And that would be one thing. But I should add that the book really speaks to the reader as someone who makes credibility judgment in his or her own life, and argues that each and every one of us can do better in the ways that we think about credibility and the ways that we judge credibility, and that is really the key to cultural transformation. It's the work that individuals on their own can do to be more fair and to better assess credibility. And I think that is kind of the overarching goal of the book. To answer your question, what can we do? Well, each one of us can do better. And the book is sort of a roadmap to how that can happen.
And can you give us one of those ways in which we ourselves could better assess credibility?
Sure. I mean, we are, even if we think we know that most sexual assault, sexual harassment takes place between people who know one another. It's not the stranger rape paradigm. We know that on some level, and yet even so, we continue to adhere to this paradigm, and a lot flows from that. We have certain expectations of perfect victims, And when someone comes forward who deviates from that perfect victim ideal, we are less likely to credit the account. And so we expect immediate reporting. We expect a physical fight in the midst of the attack. We expect perfect memory. We expect no alcohol to be involved. We expect that someone will dress a certain way and not another way. And so all of these ways in which we kind of have this perfect victim ideal in our head lead us to misjudge the credibility of someone who comes forward who isn't like that perfect victim. And I should add that no one is perfect. So of course that works to the detriment of everyone. But again, particularly to those who lack social power.
And of course, once we think of the perfect victim, we also have to think of the perfect perpetrator, the person who, I don't know if he has, and I continue saying he, but that's because that's the general standard. If he has a high position job where there's a lot of responsibility and makes lots of money for the company, then even if everyone knows there's something going on, this guy is a top notch in our company. So even if it's true, we will lose a lot of money by taking this allegation seriously, and we might as well pay her off just to get this under the carpet, let's say.
Exactly right. The flip side of the perfect victim is the monster abuser. And this too derives from this stranger rape archetype. The idea is that the monster abuser is so deviant that we would immediately be able to spot him, and he would use a weapon, and he would be so monstrous, so horrible, so heinous that he couldn't possibly be our neighbor, our coworker, our friend. And so again, when someone comes forward to accuse a man who doesn't look like a monster, that accusation is less credible. And so this is part and parcel of moving away from thinking about harassment and assault in this sort of mythical way, and trying to improve our understanding of the realities of abuse.
Wow. And there are so many places where we could go. We are running out of time. It's just that I just thought of some friends of mine who have been abused by members of their own family. So how do they deal with that? I mean, if you keep quiet, you are complicit. But if you say something, you are tearing the whole family apart. And how does a prosecutor deals with that? How does a victim deals with that? How a perpetrator who maybe did this 20 years ago, how do they deal with that now when they feel like they have been reformed? And it's just a mess. It's just so, and it's so difficult to see this from all these different dynamics.
Yes, the interfamily abuse cases are some of the most difficult, most vexing, most, just emotionally challenging to deal with. And I want to say too that these are cases that tend to be invisible. And that makes it even harder to respond in fair ways and in the ways that do right by the survivors of this kind of abuse.
Okay, Deborah, I have like a million more questions, but we're gonna let the readers read the book, and maybe you can answer those questions through the book. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do?
Thank you. Yes, the book is Credible: Why We Doubt Accusers and Protect Abusers. You can get the book anywhere online where books are sold, wherever you like to buy your books. And my website is Deborah Tuerkheimer, Deborah, Tuerkheimer, Tuerkheimer.com.
And all the links will be in the show notes. Deborah, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.